Oh, I want to welcome everybody here. Let me make sure I got everybody in the waiting room in. Yes, so I want to welcome everybody here to our lecture part of the North Carolina Maritime Museum's Maritime Heritage Lecture Series. This lecture will be presented by David Bennett, a Curator of Maritime History for the museum system. Today's lecture will be titled Fun on the Water, the Early Days of Coastal Tourism in Carteret County, North Carolina. This will be our final lecture for the fall season. Our lectures do commonly take a break in the lecture series do commonly take a break in the summer season and then come back in the fall. So our next round will start in August with actually my presentation on the Pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So definitely keep an eye on our calendar, which is up on our website, so that you can see what exciting ones we have coming up in the fall season. Otherwise, if you missed this presentation or if you want to see any of the others that we have given, all of our presentations, including this one, are recorded and then ultimately posted to the museum's website. That is ncmaritimemuseums.com. There is a drop-down menu at the top where it says Museums at Home, and you can view videos of different presentations that have been given by staff members over the last few months. This presentation, as I mentioned, is being recorded and will also be posted up there on the website in a couple of days. Now, throughout this presentation, if you have any questions or comments, what we ask of participants is to, if you are watching live through Zoom, to post your comments in the chat, and David has actually set out specific times throughout his presentation where he will pause and address any comments or questions that have been put into the chat feature. If you are watching through Facebook, go ahead and leave it in the comments, and we will relay those comments on to David as well at those appropriate times, that there's set aside times for him to address or answer as the presentation goes along. Those questions, and if you are not watching live, feel free to drop him an email or a staff member an email, and we can definitely address your comments and questions as time goes on. I've got a couple more people that are I just admitted, so I'm trying to give them a second to log in completely. But otherwise, David Bennett, I believe the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you, Christine, and thank you all for logging in and watching this. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the early days of coastal tourism in Carteret County. Originally, I wanted to do something that was more expansive of the entire coast, but just not enough time to really talk about everything. So I'm primarily going to be talking about coastal tourism in the 19th and very early 20th century, so pre-World War I. So, all right, so why did people go to the beach? It sounds like a silly question to ask, but the reasons aren't quite the same as why people go to the beach today. In the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century, malaria was a problem in Eastern North Carolina. People were suffering from it, particularly during the summer months. They thought it was caused by bad air coming up out of the swamps and marshes. And a lot of times it was called miasma, which is just bad air, ague, fever. Sometimes people said they're experiencing this bilious and intermittent fever. Those are the symptoms of malaria. They just didn't realize that it was caused by a mosquito bite. And they thought that if they would go to the coast, if they could breathe in the salt air and they could get in the salty water, that it would be a cure for them. And there's this German who's traveling through Eastern North Carolina in the 1780s, and he's writing about the health of North Carolinians, and he says all the good qualities of this tea, which he's talking about Yopon tea, praised as they are, cannot, however, prevent the sickliness of the inhabitants, especially in the low, overflowed, and swampy parts of this country, and giving the people a pale, decayed, and prematurely old look. This is the case not only about Edenton, but along the entire low-lying coast, which this fall, from Virginia to South Carolina, was visited with numerous fevers. And so the popular destinations for people to go to in order to get away from malaria and other infections along the coast was the same places that we go to today to vacation. That's Nags Head, Ocracoke, Morehead City, Beaufort, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, Southport. Those were the hot spots to go. Ocracoke, going all the way back to the colonial era and in the early federal period, was a popular destination for tourists, for people getting away from malaria. Jonathan Price in 1795 wrote about Ocracoke, "This healthy spot is in autumn the resort of many of the inhabitants of the Main. One of its original proprietors, who has attained his 90th year, still resides on it and does not appear to feel any of the infirmities of age." So sort of a fountain of youth almost. But Beaufort was also a very popular place in the early days to come and get away from malaria and other infections along the coast, and people would spend their summers here. Nags Head, North Carolina, was North Carolina's original tourist resort town that started in the 1830s. You had a Perquimans County family who were wanting to get away from malaria up in the Albemarle region. And so they bought 200 acres out on Nags Head, and their neighbors and friends wound up following them out there. And so they wound up divvying up that 200-acre plot into smaller plots. And people were just building all these beach houses, really primarily on the sound side of Nags Head. And by 1838, there's so many people who wanted to go to Nags Head that they needed a hotel out there. And so they built the Nags Head Hotel, which could accommodate about 200 plus guests. After the Civil War, people moved over to the ocean side, and things really took off after the Civil War in Nags Head. But sort of pivoting back to Carteret County, even in the late 19th century, Carteret County is seen as being a health resort. A doctor from Raleigh wrote, "I regard it as the best place for consumptive patients, for meaning people with tuberculosis, for anemic women and teething children on the continent, situated within 30 miles of the 100-fathom line of the Gulf Stream. The air is delightfully tempered by it, with no sudden change from heat to cold, or what is commonly known as northers, no miasma, complicating pneumonia and fevers, no dust, and no insect life as in Florida." So saying that there's bugs here, but not nearly as bad as in Florida. Florida was becoming a popular resort destination as well in the late 19th century. And so we're going to jump into Beaufort and Morehead. I'm going to just talk about the different places that people would stay. I'm not going to go into the history of the boarding houses and the hotels, but just to give you examples of where people were staying. This talk is primarily about recreation and what people were doing on vacation. So people had been renting out their homes along the coast for a really long time. In Beaufort, we have an advertisement here from 1818 where an 8-room house is being rented out, and they're looking to rent to a family desirous of spending a few weeks on the seaboard during the warm months. So summer vacation rentals in 1818. One of the early hotels was the Ocean House here in Beaufort. Then you had the Front Street House, was another hotel with all sorts of amenities available. You had the Atlantic House, which was sometimes called the Atlantic Hotel, and it was sort of the place to stay in Beaufort up until 1879, when it was destroyed by a hurricane. And then you also have the Davis House, or the Davis Hotel, was also another popular place to stay in the late 19th century. Then, of course, we have Morehead City and Morehead. One of the earliest hotels was the Macon House, which was a 3-story hotel, which had a ballroom and dining facilities on the first floor. And it changed hands numerous times, and it changed names. At one point, it's called the Newbern House, and other times, when Charles Wallace bought it, it's called the Charles House. And it just kept changing names. And that's a view from it in 1862 during the siege of Fort Macon. You can see the burning fort in the distance. But there wasn't really a whole lot to Moorhead at this time. And then in 1880, Moorhead really takes off as a summer destination with the construction of the Atlantic Hotel, which became known as the summer capital, because all the wealthiest and most politically influential families from like the Raleigh, Durham area would come down by train and spend their summers at the Atlantic Hotel. And there's a photo of it. Went right up to the train track, and it's in downtown. It was in downtown Moorhead, over by the Moorhead City waterfront, is where it was located. And so on this map shows the hotel here, and across the street there's a bowling alley that was owned by the hotel, and there's also a bar that was owned by the hotel as well. And they put those facilities across the street so it wouldn't cause too much noise, and so people could actually sleep and rest undisturbed at the Atlantic Hotel, which could accommodate over 300 guests. And there's a picture of the dining facility there, the ballroom, sort of a wider angle shot there of the ballroom. And then there's the piers out back, where the boats would come up to. And so any questions so far? I know we haven't covered too much, but just sort of setting up the background for the talk before we really jump into the recreational aspect.
I don't see anything on Facebook, or Cindy says nothing on Facebook at this point, and nobody has entered anything into the chat feature. So I think you're doing great.
All right. So what do people do when they're down here? Another sounds like a silly question, but it's not, because it was different in the past. The people did a lot of the same things that we do today when they go on vacation to the beach. They just did things in different ways. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is going to surround boating, or primarily sailing, in Carteret County. And so even prior to the Civil War, and going way back into the 19th century, boating was a really popular activity recreationally in Carteret County. In Beaufort, it said, the harbor so beautifully and safely landlocked from the ocean, and its tempestuous gales affords the best and finest sailing and pleasure boats to those who are fond of such pleasure. The waters abound in fish of every kind and variety. It's 1853. And so you had the Front Street house prior to the Civil War is offering pleasure boats manned by sailors to take people out on sailing and fishing excursions. And a lot of the hotels were actually doing this. The boats were kind of package deal with your vacation, almost. So some of the locals, they'd take people out in cunners, which are split log dugout canoe boats. There's documentation that people are using these boats in recreational capacities, but more commonly in Carteret County, people are using something called that's the locals refer to as clinker built boats, or lap strake boats. And we don't really have photos of these boats. They seem to have gone out of use by the 1880s, and we'll get into that. But clinker is just simply lap strake construction, where you've got the side planking is overlapping. And these boats, the average length was about 22 feet. They're open boats with center boards, and they're rigged in the spritsail configuration. So jib, mainsail, topsail. Yeah. And then George Ives wrote about these clinker-built boats. He said the boats used for business and pleasure sailing were deep, sharp, clinker-built, fast sailors, but totally unfitted for shoal water navigation. And typically, when you have a deep, sharp boat, you're going to have a deeper draft a lot of times, and so it'd be easy to get hung up on the shoals and sandbars. And so this is a picture of the types of boat that was used in the whaling and sort of mullet fisheries, built on Shackleford by Divine Guthrie right here. And this is a lapstrake or clinker built boat, probably not the same type of boat, but might have been sort of similar. We don't really know for sure. There's no pictures or there's no photos, drawings of these clinker built sailboats from this area. But in the 1870s, you had George Ives introduce the Sharpie to North Carolina. He brings the Lucia and Ella from New Haven, Connecticut, primarily as a commercial fishing boat, but it also takes off very quickly as a recreational vessel as well, because it's a flat bottom boat, shallow draft. It can go just about anywhere in the sounds and creeks and rivers of Carteret County. In 1878, there's 30 boats for hire in Beaufort, or 30 boats that were available for charter. 2 of those were Sharpies. Those were the boats that are owned by George Ives. And then all the rest were these clinker-built boats. In Morehead City in 1878, there's a number of clinker-built boats, and there's one Sharpie. There's the Julia Bell, which is owned by Daniel Bell, and it is probably the first Sharpie that was built in North Carolina. And this is actually a photo here of the Julia Bell with a load of tourists at Shackleford Banks. And so in 1884, people are talking about how the Sharpies are replacing clinker boats, and the Goldsboro Messenger wrote, the aggregate tonnage of these little boats, meaning Sharpies, which have taken the place of clinker boats, is given at 1,339 barrels, which I think is about 100, a barrel was about 118 pounds. So there's a lot of Sharpies in Carteret County at the time. And Sharpies become the preferred charter boat in Carteret County. They're used for fishing charters, ferrying people to and from the beach. They're doing day and evening cruises and excursions. And a lot of the hotels are supplying these boats, or people are contracting with hotels to also provide services. A lot of businessmen in Eastern North Carolina saw how the Sharpies were really taking off as charter boats, and they start building them as purpose-built recreational charter boats. You had Thomas Daniels, C.T. Watson, George Ives. They're 3 of the biggest wholesale fish dealers in Eastern North Carolina in the late 19th century, and these guys had Sharpies built specifically to cater to tourists in Morehead and Beaufort. There are also other tourists or other businessmen as well who are doing this. One of the big ways that Sharpies were used was getting people to and from Beaufort, going from the train station in Morehead City over to Beaufort, because there wasn't a train or there wasn't a bridge for a long time. And so you had John Greer, who's a boat builder in New Bern, actually built a Sharpie for someone who was getting into this business of taking people to and from Morehead and Beaufort. And he built a 27 foot Sharpie in 1881. And there's a lot of other people who are doing this as well. And this is the route from the train station in Morehead to Beaufort. And they're just going through the thoroughfare here. And this is just this route. And then in the very early 20th century, there's finally a railroad trestle that's extended from Morehead City over to Beaufort. And so getting to Beaufort becomes easier because you have a train track there. And this is the first train headed over to Beaufort from Morehead. And then this is the train station in Beaufort. And even though you still have the train that's taking people, across to Beaufort, Sharpies are still being used a lot for water taxis around Beaufort, just every day back and forth from Moorhead and Beaufort, people are still using a lot of Sharpies. And by 1891, there's nearly 100 Sharpies in Moorhead City and Beaufort that are catering to tourists. So this chartering is huge. It's big business. And there's so much competition with these Sharpies that there's people from Carteret County are leaving during the summertime with their Sharpies and going to places where there's fewer boats. They're going to Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach, and Ocracoke and offering their services there. And so, for example, you had the Willis brothers from Moorhead City. I'm not sure which Willis brothers they're referring to because there's so many Willises. But anyways, these brothers, three brothers, they took two Sharpies to Ocracoke and they set up shop, and they were taking people out on fishing and sailing excursions. And they even had a small convenience store on Ocracoke. And then one day in June 1896, you had this crowd of locals from Ocracoke chase them off. And it's not exactly explained why. It might have had to do with the fact that there's a lot of people from Ocracoke who are trying to do the same thing, and they didn't appreciate outsiders competing with them. But there's a lot of people from Carteret County who were going down to Wrightsville Beach and with their Sharpies and providing their services down there. You have 5 Sharpies that I've got listed here, and locals from Moorhead. And eventually that's sort of cut short in the early 20th century because there's a bridge that's built across the sound to Wrightsville Beach. It's a railroad trestle. And this was big business, just ferrying people back and forth, these Moorhead City Sharpies to the beach. And when they're getting ready to build this thing, people are saying, well, isn't this going to cut into the business of these charter boats? And the town of Wrightsville Beach said, well, we don't care because all these people are from off. They're not locals. And so the business kind of petered out some after that, with the exception probably offshore fishing. But this is a picture of the train that would go across the sound to Wrightsville Beach. And so is there any questions at this point? This is just kind of setting up with boats. There's going to be more.
I have a couple comments from Facebook, actually.
Yeah.
So Linda from Facebook said, just wanted to let you know that she loves the drawings and the pictures that you're using.
Yeah.
And Chris had a question from earlier in the presentation about, is there a comprehensive history of yellow fever and other summer epidemics in North Carolina?
I don't know I'm not aware of a history of it. I've seen just like some blog articles, but if you actually go back and look at like old travel diaries and just primary sources and like the colonial and early state papers in North Carolina, they talk a lot about things like malaria, which of course they're calling it miasma ague, other names. There's other diseases like quinsy was a problem in the 18th century. So quinsy is basically a disease where your tonsils get infected. And you develop abscesses on your tonsils, and people were dying from that in Eastern North Carolina, where these abscesses were bursting and just, yeah.
I also know that Lori Sanderlin down in our Maritime Museum in Southport has done some research into that topic. So you can find her email address through our website. So she'd be worth. There's a couple more. Hold on. We have. Tom from Facebook wants to know, was there any visitation during the years of the War for Southern Independence?
So during the Civil War, it kind of, things were put on hold during the Civil War. And in Beaufort, you still have these boarding houses and hotels, and they have advertisements, but you can't tell if there's anything going on. I imagine probably the Union Army and Navy are probably taking up shop in some of these places. I know in Nags Head, the Nags Head Hotel was burned during the Civil War by Confederate forces, trying to deny it as a place for the Union to set up headquarters. And after the Civil War, it got a bigger and better hotel was built at Nag's Head, called the Nag's Head Hotel. But really, tourism really kind of takes off after the Civil War and becomes a really big thing here in the South.
And I think we've talked you and I have talked about how it tends to pause during times of conflict like World War
Yeah,
I or World War.
yeah. There's a lot of activities like commercial fishing. During wartime, kind of pause on it. Yeah,
Makes sense.
people are involved in fighting. Anything else?
You're busy. Yeah. I think that is everything from Facebook, and I don't have anything in the chat here. Nope. So doing
Okay.
great.
So, of course, going to the beach was a real popular activity as it is today, just a little bit harder. Um, but it's funny if you forgot, if you're in Moorhead or Beaufort and you forgot your bathing suit at home, like if you're from Raleigh or something, you forgot your bathing suit, it wasn't that big of a deal because some of the hotels, like the Atlantic Hotel, had a selection of over 300 bathing suits that you could choose from and borrow. And some people were even like putting in orders by telegraph to clothing stores in Raleigh, and then those stores in Raleigh would put a bathing suit on a train and send it down to them. So you could get a bathing suit quickly while you're on vacation. But how did people get to the beach? Because there's no bridges that are going across Bogue Sound to get to places like where Atlantic Beach is today. But people were going there, so you had to hire a boat. People were hiring these Sharpies. And so a lot of people were leaving from the Moorhead City waterfront or from the Atlantic Hotel, and they're headed down to where these wharves are in Bogue Sound over by Bogue Banks. And that's how they're getting to the beach. And in late 19th century, there's actually a boardwalk that was going from the sound side to the ocean side, so people could walk to the ocean after they got off a boat. You could also take a horse. There's stables on Bogue Banks that are owned by the Atlantic Hotel that during the summertime they kept horses there for people to use. And there's also changing facilities on the ocean side as well for people to change into their bathing suits. And this is a picture of a pavilion that was owned by the Atlantic Hotel. And this is in where Atlantic Beach is today. And this is where people would go and hang out. And then people would, change into their bathing suits and go swimming. And then I have an example of a beach party from 1885 where this lady, Mrs. Tucker, was staying at the Atlantic Hotel, and she invited over 200 guests from the Atlantic Hotel to go and have fun with her at the beach. And she hired 6 Sharpies to shuttle everyone across the Sound. And they had a good old time. And there's people swimming and getting, pummeled in the shore break. And that's what people did. And that's, how they had fun. Another thing that people did was they would take horse-drawn carriages and go riding along the beach. And people today, you take our trucks out on the beach and go riding. People took horses and carriages and did the exact same thing. So similar, but just different. People would also go swimming in the Sound. They go swimming in Bogue Sound, and it was considered an inferior form of swimming. The better part was going to the beach. That was more fun because you had the crashing waves and all of that. An exception, though, would be at nighttime. So they're talking about if a bath in the waters of the Sound is a pleasure by day, it becomes a miracle at night. Then the water is ablaze with phosphorescence and is a scene of inexpressible splendor. So what they're talking about is bioluminescence. So this is kind of what this looks like. This plankton is lighting up at night as people are moving through the water. And imagine coming to the beach for the first time, coming from a place like Raleigh, and this is what you're encountered by. I'm sure it really was a magical time for people. So you had daytime excursions. Again, sailboats, Sharpies is how people are getting around. People are going to Fort Macon, just like we do today. Fort Macon was pretty rough back then. It was overgrown. But you had Friedrich Olds, who was a famous North Carolinian, and he said that any trip to Beaufort without a trip to the life-saving station in Old Fort Macon would really not be a trip at all. And so if you're going on vacation to Carteret County and you're not going to Fort Macon, then you're really missing out, is kind of the attitude. There was a tower at the life-saving station or by Fort Macon, and it had a big tower that people would go up and have this big sort of aerial view of the area. That's popular. People also went out to Shackleford Banks. They'd go explore the mullet camps, these thatched huts, and they would talk about how it was like a scene out of Robinson Crusoe, and they'd go watch people fishing. And there's even some people that sort of fantasized about, giving it up, giving up the city life and coming down and getting into commercial fishing and living on the coast. There's this one story where these family, they're sitting on a sand dune watching people go mullet fishing, and this guy's his husband and wife are talking about giving up the city life and living this sort of austere lifestyle fishing. And then this teenage daughter pipes up and says, but I don't want to give up my comfortable bed at the Atlantic Hotel and the fancy balls and the evening dresses and the wonderful dinners. Like, what are y'all people thinking? What are y'all saying? But anyways, it's just sort of a funny story. They'd also go out to the Maritime forest and look around. And there used to be fig trees out in the Maritime forest that had been planted by people out there. And they'd go and visit some of the small communities like Diamond City and Wade Shore and check things out and see how people were living out in Shackleford Banks. And there's even the pony penning. And there's a photo of a pony roundup. And some of the tourists even bought ponies. You could buy like a pony for like 20 or 30 bucks. And if you wanted one that was trained, you'd pay like 70 bucks. And then people also went to Cape Lookout. They go check out the lighthouse there, like people do today. There's also a U.S. Life-Saving Service station there that people would go and check out and explore. And then there's on the ocean side, there's all these shipwrecks. And people would go and look at the shipwrecks, and they would break off pieces of these shipwrecks and take them home as souvenirs. And it was just something fun that people really enjoy doing. So baseball, in the late 19th century, people got to watch baseball games down here. Today, you've got like the Morehead City Marlins, and people will go watch them during the summertime. But if you want to see a baseball game back then, people were going down to Davis Island, down east in like Core Sound. So Davis Island's over by Davis Shore, Smyrna, that area. And the island in the late 19th century was bought by this eccentric New York millionaire, Henry Leckler, who at the time the island was about 300 acres, and he dumped like 12,000 loads of topsoil on that island and started a 100-acre farm that employed 18 employees. 18 people is enough for 2 baseball teams. And the man was obsessed with baseball. He even employed a baseball trainer on the island. And so on Saturdays, they'd have these baseball games, and people at the hotels in Beaufort and Morehead City, they'd get on Sharpies and they'd go out to Davis Island and they'd have a picnic and they would watch baseball games. And sometimes the team on Davis Island would sort of issue a challenge to some of the men at like the Atlantic Hotel, and they'd have this baseball game. And of course, always the men from the Atlantic Hotel would get completely humiliated and whooped up on, but they felt like they had the play regardless because their wives were watching. And here's a group photo from probably Davis Island. Supporting documentation that went along with this photo collection said that people had a picnic and had gone swimming at Davis Island and had a photo taken in a live oak grove. And these people, half of them have bathing suits on and they're in a live oak grove. And so I'm pretty sure this was a group photo on Davis Island. But anyways, Camp Glen, which was on the sort of, at the time, was on the fringe of Morehead City. It's actually part of Morehead City today. It's where the Carteret Community College is located. you had starting in the early 20th century, a military encampment, sort of the equivalent of would be the National Guard would go and encamp there, and they'd go on maneuvers, and people would go and they'd watch them and they'd interact with the soldiers. A lot of times the officers and their families stayed at the Atlantic Hotel and socialized with the people there. And here's a photo prior to World War I of Camp Glen, and the people or the soldiers there. And then this is the pier at Camp Glen, and people would bring the Sharpies up there, and they'd get off and they'd go check things out there with the encampment. And so sometimes you'd have these U.S. naval vessels or these U.S. Revenue cutters that would come to Carteret County. They drew too much water to go into like Beaufort or Moorhead because this is prior to the port, and they'd be a little ways offshore. And so people would take their boats and they'd go sail around and check out these vessels. And a lot of times the officers would stay and socialize at the Atlantic Hotel. And sometimes they'd offer these VIP tours of these vessels, and people would sail out to them and go on tours. This is a picture of the USS Prairie, which was part of the naval militia in the late 19th, early 20th century, which was like the U.S. Naval Reserve. And there was a U.S. Naval Reserve group in Beaufort. And so the USS Prairie came. It was offshore of Carteret County. And so people went and checked that boat out, and we know for sure. And actually, there was quite a scene in Beaufort because of the Prairie, because these guys who were part of the naval militia, when the ship came, decided they didn't want to join, so they were taken away in chains aboard this vessel. So people also went on gambling cruises. They'd tell their wives that they're going to go fishing offshore, and so they'd pack all this fishing gear up in a Sharpie and they'd head out. And as soon as they're outside the inlet, they would go and have high stakes poker games. And then there was also moonlight sailing. So people would go out on these cruises on Sharpies at night, and they'd have like bottles of champagne that they're drinking, and they'd have hors d'oeuvres, and sometimes they even have these stringed instrument bands that would be providing musical entertainment. It is quite the thing. And a lot of times these moonlight sailing cruises were preceded by balls at the Atlantic Hotel. So people dance the night away at the ballroom, and around 11, 12 o'clock at night, the dance would end, and then they'd have the after party on the Sharpies sailing around at night. And so sort of the popular dance during the late 19th century was this dance. It's very weird. It's called the German. You can go online and find some videos of it. It's this sort of odd ballroom dance, but it was popular. And during the dancing, sometimes people would break away, these young couples, and they'd steal off to a Sharpie. And the News Observer in 1888 wrote that another popular style of sailing here is to get your girl in a Sharpie, which is made fast to the wharf, and then push the boat off as far as the line will permit, and sit close up to the little timid creature to prevent her from getting frightened. This kind of sailing has many advantages. You're not so much crowded, the water not too rough, and the breakers not so dangerous. The boys say the motion of the boat is at rocks, to and from with the tide, and the closeness of the girl is too delightful to be described. So it's sort of like parking in the late 19th century. There's sort of summer romance going on in the boats behind the Atlantic Hotel. So any questions at this point?
I have a couple for you from Facebook, and I have a feeling that most recent quote's probably going to bring in a couple comments.
Yeah.
That was it. But before, so let me see. So Linda from Facebook wanted to know, as far as bathing suits go, bathing suits didn't look much different than their regular clothing until about the 1920s or so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and yeah,
I know that they looked very similar. You had to be very familiar with the fashion.
is very conservative.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, bathing suits actually in the 1800s, when recreation, like what we're talking about with the
Yeah.
railroad and everything, that's kind of what stemmed the creation of specific bathing gear. So,
Well, that and like the you really see an evolution in bathing suits, especially around World War II,
mhm.
when people are trying to conserve cloth.
And there are
That's when things get skimpier. It's World War II.
Um, let's see. Oh, Tom was returning to his comment about the visitation during the War of Southern Independence. Just to add on, he wanted to say, I imagine some of the Federals brought their wives and families down once Fort Lincoln
Yeah.
was captured.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot that was going on in Beaufort during the Civil War. There's a lot of interesting things, and there's a lot of people that when they came to Beaufort during the war, there's a lot of people that never left. They loved it so much down here.
And then we have Danny from who's watching through Zoom wanted to know how dangerous was the sailing, especially at night?
I, I don't know how dangerous the night sailing was. I imagine there's certainly an element of risk, a huge element of risk with it. There are a lot of stories of accidents happening with tourists on the water. There was an instance is 1880s or 1890s, I can't remember which, but there's a Sharpie that was going up around Fort Macon close to the shore and it hit something and tore the bottom of the boat open and sank. And miraculously, no one was injured, no one drowned. Um, but there's stories like that um, all the time. And there's actually a lot of stories down in the Cape Fear area where there's accidents with Sharpies with tourists. Um, so yeah, I imagine it's kind of dangerous, but these captains, these a lot of them are commercial fishermen. Um, they're really good sailors, and so I think they're you know it wasn't overly dangerous, but you know.
And then I just have to make a correction. I unfortunately misquoted the comment about the Federals bringing their wives and families down was actually another visitor named Michael who was
Okay,
commenting on Facebook. So
gotcha.
I wanted to make sure I
Yeah.
properly credited that question. But otherwise, I don't see any more in the chat, and I don't believe Facebook has any more. So thank you very much.
All right. So fishing, of course, really popular. Um, you had sport fishing back then. It's different. It was different then than it is today. So on the outside of Beaufort Inlet, people were going after bluefish, kingfish, and Spanish mackerel primarily. Um, then the favored species on the inside were hogfish, spot croaker, mullet, and trout. Um, so during the summertime, you had a bunch of commercial fishermen would transition to doing fishing charters. And that was because commercial fishing tend to be less active during the summer, and fishing charters provided year-round employment. And beginning around May or June, the fishermen would whitewash and repair their sails. They'd paint their boats and they'd install cushions to make things comfortable for the tourists. And this is a photo of a Sharpie, the Samuel Buckman, which was for most of the year a commercial vessel, but during the summertime it did cater to tourists and the fishing trips. Then some of the fees that I've seen for going out on these fishing charters, like in 1888, you could hire a Sharpie out of Moorhead for 50 cents a day per person. You could get your bait, your lines. They're fishing with hand lines primarily. And there's also ice and ice water, again, cushion seats. 1894, I saw there was some Sharpies that you could rent for $3 a day. In this photo here, there's a family that's gone on a fishing trip. And then this man right here, his name's Teen Piner, and he was one of the popular uh, fishing charter captains out of Moorhead. His real name is Augustine um, Piner, and Teen was just sort of a nickname, a shortened version of his name. Yeah, just some kids with a little bit of bait fish with Sharpies in the background. So the popular fishing spots were Beaufort Inlet, the Bight around Cape Lookout. Again, this is pre-Barden Inlet, so there's no inlet here. So people were having to go on the outs, go through Beaufort Inlet and come on down to Cape Lookout that way. And then they're also fishing wrecks and reefs are offshore. The farthest that I saw people go was about 12 miles offshore, which is pretty impressive. And so the catch, what they would do with the fish they would catch is you could take them back to the hotel and the cooks there would clean and prepare the fish for you. This is Atlantic Hotel, and they had a fishing dock here that a lot of the commercial fishermen would pull up to, but you know, your boat, your charter boat could pull up to as well, offload the fish, go to the kitchen, and it would be served up for you in the dining room. And there's a picture of trout, and then a Spanish mackerel. And with Spanish mackerel, this guy Connor wrote, I have never experienced delirium until I saw 15-pound Spanish mackerel leap into the air in a struggle to shake himself free of the well-hooked artificial squid at the end of a 200 feet of stout line. And then he also wrote that some of the very largest mackerel caught this season were hooked by ladies who are as devoted to the sport as men. So women in the late 19th century were also getting into sport fishing. And then you have these ladies who they're fishing out at Shackleford Banks with actual with rods and reels. You got the Sharpie that they had taken out there. But again, most of the fishing was done by hand line. And then you have the bluefish. And this is a long quote here, but it's really good one from the 1870s, saying fast sailing, clinker built, sloop rigged open boat sailing back and forth in the inlet just on the edge of the breakers, the ravenous bluefish snapping at your spoon, sometimes taking it before it barely touches the water, with 3 other jolly fellows all pulling for dear life to beat your score, every fellow with a 6-pounder almost certainly, and at times to have 10 to 12 pounds of animated fish fast hold of your hook, making your muscles crack to pull them in, all constitutes what to my mind is an A plus ultra of sport, that's Latin for the pinnacle, so the pinnacle of sport. And so you had African-American fishing guides out of Beaufort. This one guy wrote, if you go to Beaufort and want boats for blue fishing, any of the following men will be available and do your work well. They're all good sailors and know where the game uses. At the head of the list, I placed the names Alfred and Henry Boyd, Stephen Turner, Joseph Fisher, but almost any of the colored boatmen will give you good sport. And so these men he lists, they are African American, and about 2/3 of the listed fishing guides out of Beaufort in the 1870s were African American. And then there's also a lot of African American fishing guides or charter boat captains out of Moorhead as well. This crowd that was going out to Cape Lookout in 1889 wrote that they boarded a Sharpie well manned by gentlemen of the African persuasion and set sail from Moorhead for the fishing ground. And on that trip, they caught 253 fish, which that was common. People are trying to catch as many fish as they can because the experience was more about quantity over quality. So you basically were fishing till the point of exhaustion. And they wrote, that wasn't much for Moorhead fishing, but it was something for us. So people were catching more fish than 253 in a day. And then there's not a lot of photos that are actually taken aboard Sharpies. But you have this, it's a group of people going out sailing, tourists on one, and you have here an African-American boatman at the tiller. And you have a lot of these black charter boat captains out of Carteret County because a lot of them had formerly been enslaved watermen. And of course, you know, after the Civil War, after they're free, they're still working on the water. And a lot of them are commercial fishermen, and they know where all the best fishing is. They know where the shoals are. They know how to navigate on the sounds and how to get through the inlets. And so they're valued for their expertise. And they're just really popular. there's some other reasons why as well, but I need to do a bit more research to get into that. There's Governor Fowle really enjoyed coming to Carter County to go on fishing and hunting trips. He even had his own Sharpie, the Daniel G. Fowle. Then you had President Grover Cleveland came down to Moorhead in 1894, went fishing, probably for bluefish. He really enjoyed blue fishing, I believe. And he went up with Captain Evans on the Violet. And there's this snippet saying Grover from a newspaper, Grover the Great kindly left the poor fishermen of eastern North Carolina a few fish in the trolling grounds down there. The country would rather have which would be Senator David B. Hill, go fishing a little more, and President Grover Cleveland a little less. So people were complaining back then that Grover Cleveland was going hunting and fishing too much, kind of like how we complain about presidents going to play golf too much today. So is there any questions about this?
I believe we have at least one comment on Facebook.
Yeah.
Linda wants to know, what were the fishing lines made of in the 1800s?
I'm not positive, because it's not. They don't tell you what they're made of. They just said they just said. Of course, it wouldn't be like a plastic or nylon or anything like that. It might have been some sort of cotton weave. I'm not sure exactly. I haven't looked into the sort of material. They just say that they just mention that people are using hand lines and that they're being provided, as package deal with these trips.
And also, Linda also wanted to know, I wonder if these African American men had been in the Menhaden fishing, or did that come later?
So Menhaden fishing started almost in North Carolina almost immediately after the Civil War started in 1865. And it was started by Union veterans from Rhode Island, and it kind of took off from there. Menhaden got to be bigger going later into the 19th century, but a lot of these guys were probably more involved in things like the mullet fishery. There's also a lot of subsistence fishing that African Americans and just other people in general were into, and so people were really adept around here at fishing. But there's David Soselsky's The Waterman's Song is this great book about African American watermen, both slaved and free ones, in the antebellum period. So yeah. Any more?
I believe, I believe that is everything. So thank you very much.
All right. So racing was also a huge pastime. It was a sport that people would watch. You had these Sharpie races, and this is actually a photo of the annual Sharpie regatta that was held in Morehead City, and I can't believe I was able to get this photo, but this photo came out of North Carolina Archives and is really cool. You got this Sharpie right here and a couple other ones behind it in the background. But anyways, so you have an ad here for a boat regatta that was sponsored by the Macon House in 1867. So right after the Civil War. And what's interesting is they say boat race, no canoes entered. So they're talking about no dugout canoe boats. And so they only want to have this has been pre-Sharpie, so they would have had these clinker built boats they would have been racing. And then with the Sharpies, you had your annual Sharpie regatta, but there's also other Sharpie races throughout the summer. And a lot of them were sponsored by the Atlantic Hotel, and they had trophies and cash prizes, especially the annual race. And they were presented by the female guests of the Atlantic Hotel. And there's also a ball for the winner that went late into the night. There's also the Teachers Assembly, which was this conference center for teachers right next door to the Atlantic Hotel. And when that usually took place in June, and they would have a Sharpie race that coincided with the teachers' assembly, and the prize of the winner was presented by prize by the prettiest teacher at the assembly, and it was the prettiest teacher was selected by a panel of judges who were principals from teachers all across, or principals from schools all across North Carolina. It's kind of weird, but that's what they did. A coveted prize from the annual Sharpie regatta was the racing pennant, which was flown from the topmast of a Sharpie, and it was to signal that just the bragging rights. You had the fastest Sharpie on the Sound. You're the best sailor on the Sound, and you were given the title of Commodore of the Fleet if you won that annual race, and you hold that title until you were defeated in the annual Sharpie regatta. And then there were spritzel skiff races that took place that were also sponsored by the Atlantic Hotel. Smaller cash prize, and they don't appear to be as popular because they are smaller boats, and they're not romanticized nearly as much in the 19th and early 20th centuries as they are today. The Sharpies were the popular boats. Those were the charter boats. And if you won with a Sharpie, these charter boat captains usually got more business because they're recognized as being the best and fastest. And this is actually the racing route for the annual Sharpie regatta. It started and ended at the Atlantic Hotel. They'd go down to Fort Macon, they'd turn around and head up Bogue Sound, roughly to where about the Atlantic Beach Bridge is today, and then they turn around and they'd go back to the Atlantic Hotel, and that was the course. Then there's hunting was also provided another source of tourism. This was a source of year-round tourism, so people were coming in the winter to go do things like waterfowl hunting in Core Sound, which a lot of people know about. There's deer hunting, even fox hunting around Morehead City. You had Harbor Island, which is this little, looks like a little sandbar right here. And is at the northern mouth of Core Sound, right on the edge of the Pamlico Sound, close to Cedar Island. And in the 1880s, you had this Mr. Pike from New York, bought it for a nominal sum of money. And he and his buddies turned it into a hunting club. It became the Harbor Island Gun Club. And they had this big 2-story house out there, massive fireplaces, and they even had a butler out there. And it became a really popular place for people to come and go waterfowl hunting from up north. It was also a popular stopping off point for boats, for yachts that were coming down, getting ready to come down through Core Sound. So people traveling down the coast, and they would sometimes stop and rest there overnight because they didn't want to try and cross through Core Sound at night because it was just so shallow. Back to Davis Island. So in 1904, Leckler sold the island to George Deming, who is this business executive from Cleveland, Ohio, and he used it as a winter hunting retreat, but he also would come down during summers, and he had a big yacht that he had, and he actually passed away while on a trip down to Davis Island. And the family held on to the property for a while, and Charles Lumsden of Newbern managed that property, and it became a popular hunting club. And what's interesting about Deming is not only did he purchase Davis Island, but he also purchased a ton of property along Core Sound. So these little islands that are on the backside of Core Banks, he purchased a lot of these islands, and he also purchased a bunch of marshland around Nelson Bay, and going all the way down to Davis Shore and up around Smyrna, buying these little islands and bits of marsh. And it was so he could have exclusive hunting rights in these areas. And that Davis Island really did develop into this hunting destination because they're buying up all this property in Core Sound for hunting. And then going out into Craven County, up around Havelock, you have out in the Croatan, you have these lakes, and people would get on the train and they'd head up to Havelock. Havelock was just a tiny village, in the late 19th century, and they'd get off the train and they go by horseback into the Croatan. They go hunting around these lakes. There's a lot of deer, a lot of waterfowl back here. There's even people taking ox carts with boats into the Croatan and launching the boats on these lakes and going waterfowl hunting back there. So just more places where people are going hunting while on vacation in Carter County. They even go up in the Craven County. So there's also fox hunting in and around Morehead City. People would take their horses and hounds and put them on trains and send them down to the Atlantic Hotel, where there are stables and kennels where they could keep their animals. And then they would go on these fox hunts in the forests and farms around Morehead City. It is quite the thing. But anyways, that's really all that I have with this presentation. That's all the things that people were doing around here in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, prior to World War One. So, let me know if there's any more questions or comments.
I think it was a great presentation. I don't have anything new on Facebook. I have made it so participants can unmute themselves on the Zoom chat if anybody has anything that they wanted to add at this point. Otherwise, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to either email David directly. You can find his email address through the museum's website at NC Maritime museumsbeaufort.com, or you can also find all of our staff members through ncmaritimemuseums.com and email them if you have any appropriate questions. I do have one, just came in through our chat. It said, Danny wanted to let you know, great presentation and thank you. And apparently there is one currently being typed into Facebook. And while we're waiting for that one, I do want to remind everyone our Maritime Heritage Lecture Series does take a little bit of a pause during the summer, during our busier months, and it'll come back in the fall with our first one in August with me, with Ann Bonney and Mary Reed, and then I believe Michelle Crepeau, our museum conservator, will follow up in September with the second presentation on conservation. Okay, so from Facebook, Linda wanted to tell you thank you. John says, thanks, I really enjoyed it. Michael says, great job, thanks for sharing. And Nancy says, thank you. So as we all know, you did a great job.
Yeah, and thank you all very much for tuning in and watching and listening. It was a lot of fun doing the research and putting this together. And this is just Carteret County. So sometime in the future, I'll do a presentation on Nag's Head. I'll do a presentation on tourism on Ocracoke, the Carolina, Wrightsville Beach area in Southport, so that general sort of Cape Fear area. I'll do that too in the future. It's just it's too much for one presentation. But yeah, there'll be more coming on tourism later in the future.
Oh, one more just came in through Facebook.
Okay.
David says, thank you. Very interesting. I'm from Elizabeth City and would spend my summers at Nag's Head and later Southern Shores. So
yeah.
Definitely something. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and end the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.